Naomi Hart had just pulled a stained flour sack across her north window when Silas Webb, the glass seller, stopped in the road and said her cabin looked abandoned. Two women beside his wagon laughed. Naomi kept one hand on the burlap and the other around a pine slat. Old feed lettering showed through the faded weave. One corner bore a blue patch where she had doubled the sack. "Covering good glass with stable cloth," Silas said. "That is a new kind of thrift." "It is not touching the glass," Naomi replied. Her sister Faye stood on a low bench, holding the far end of the slat. At 16, she had learned to ignore most town talk. But Naomi saw her glance toward the women. Faye's grip loosened. The slat tipped. Naomi caught it before the nail scraped the pane. "Hold it level." Faye raised it again, cheeks red from more than cold. The Hart cabin stood alone on a rise north of the Sweetwater Trail, with nothing between its windows and the wind but a rail fence and winter grass. The year before, frost had spread across the inside of the glass until the kitchen seemed walled in white. By February, loose putty had fallen from the north frame, and every gust had breathed through the gap. Naomi could not afford another winter like that. She had counted the firewood and pressed every window edge with her thumb. She knew which pane rattled first and which corner gathered frost before midnight. She had washed old feed sacks, dried them near the stove, and sewn them into layered covers. Small wood blocks held the burlap several inches beyond the glass. The empty space between cloth and pane was the part no one noticed. Silas stepped closer. "Wet burlap will rot the frame. Then I will take it down wet. It will freeze. Then I will change the fastenings." He smiled. "I have a pane at the shop near this size. I could put your name in the winter book. Payment after spring trade." Faye looked at Naomi. A new pane would have been a comfort. Credit would have been easier than sewing by lamplight with stiff fingers and borrowed cord. Silas rested a glove on his wagon. "But I will not guarantee a frame wrapped in this. Take the sacks down, and I will measure tomorrow." Travelers had begun slowing to stare. A boy pointed toward the covered windows, and his father pulled his hand down without correcting his grin. Naomi turned back to the frame. "No debt," she said. "And the covers stay?" Faye's mouth tightened, but she held the slat steady. Naomi drove the first nail through a leather washer so the wood would not split. She fixed the other end, checked the space behind the burlap, and slid her fingers between the cover and glass. Cold air rested there, still and separate from the moving wind. She guided Faye's hand into the gap. "Feel that?" Faye nodded. "The wind can spend itself on the cloth," Naomi said. "The glass only faces what gets through." For the first time, Faye studied the cover instead of the people watching it. Naomi handed her a brush and a cup of blue paint. "Put a dot near every edge, then another halfway to the center." "Why?" "So we know where the frost reaches." Faye painted the first mark inside the pane, bright against the dim kitchen. Silas climbed onto his wagon. "When that ugliness tears loose," he called, "remember I offered proper help." Naomi tightened the temporary cord at the upper corner and tested it twice. The knot held. Though the fibers were older than she liked, the wagon rolled away. The laughter faded along the frozen road. Then the north wind struck the cabin. The fastening snapped tight. The upper slat jerked outward. Before Naomi could reach it, the loose burlap whipped back and slapped the window with a hard, flat crack. The burlap struck the pane once, then ballooned away from it. Naomi caught the loose corner before the next gust could drive it back. "Inside," she told Faye. Faye jumped from the bench and ran through the door. Naomi stayed outside with one boot braced against the wall, holding the wet cloth away from the glass. The upper cord had slipped against the temporary nail. If she pulled it tighter, the old fibers might snap. If she let go, the slat would strike the pane again. Through the window, Faye pressed both palms against the inner frame. Naomi eased the strain from the cord, removed the crooked nail, and drove a fresh one through a folded leather washer. Then she wrapped the line twice around the new fastening instead of trusting the single knot. The cover settled several inches beyond the pane. No crack spread through the glass. Faye opened the door. "Did it break?" "Not yet." The words landed harder than Naomi intended. She brought the cover inside before dusk and laid it across the table. The upper corner had stretched where the loose slat pulled against the seam. Naomi folded another strip of burlap over the damaged place and drove her needle through 4 layers. Faye watched from the stove. "You knew they would laugh." Naomi pulled the wax thread tight. I knew they might. You could have told them what it was for. They were not asking. I was... Naomi stopped sewing. Faye looked toward the dark window where blue dots waited along the glass. You told me where to paint. You did not tell me why until Silas made it sound foolish. The cabin ticked softly as the stove warmed the boards. Naomi set the needle down. Your brother-in-law used canvas walls at freight camps, not against the bunks. A little distance away, the wind struck the canvas first, and the air behind it stayed quieter. You think sacks can do the same thing? I think we can test whether they do. Faye came to the table. Together they re-sewed the stretch corner, added a second spacer block, and replaced the temporary upper tie with 2 separate cords. Naomi left enough play for the cover to move without collapsing against the pane. On the smallest east window, she installed no cover at all. That one stays bare, she said. Faye frowned. Wouldn't it be safer to cover everyone? Safer does not teach us which part worked. Before bed, Faye pressed 1 blue dot near each edge of both panes and another line of dots halfway toward the center. On a stiff scrap of wrapping paper, she drew 2 rectangles and copied the marks. Naomi noted the wind direction beside them. By midnight, the north gust had sharpened. The uncovered east pane rattled in its frame. The covered north window moved less, though the burlap whispered against the slats. At dawn, Faye reached the kitchen first. The uncovered pane had turned white from every edge. Frost buried the outer dots and crept almost to the center. On the covered window, a narrow rim of ice marked the corners, but the middle remained clear. 4 blue dots still showed through untouched glass. Faye held the paper card against the pane and stared between the 2 patterns. It stopped here, she said, touching the frost line. It slowed there, Naomi corrected. One cold night does not prove a winter. But Faye was already drawing the new boundary on the card. A wet thumb smudged 1 blue line. She did not notice. Naomi stepped outside to inspect the cover. The lower burlap edge had darkened with blown snow, and moisture had worked into the cords. She tested the spacing, then reached for the upper corner to loosen it before the day warmed. The knot would not move. She pulled harder. The cord had frozen into a solid white lump against the frame, and with every gust, its hardened edge sawed deeper into the wood. The frozen cord had already cut a pale groove into the frame. Naomi went inside, set a narrow iron tool beside the stove, and waited until the metal grew warm enough to soften ice without scorching wood. Faye stood at the north window with the frost card tucked under one arm. You are not pouring hot water on it, she asked, and freeze twice as much by noon. Naomi wrapped the tool in cloth, stepped outside, and pressed its edge against the hardened knot. Steam lifted in the thin threads. She worked slowly until the outer ice loosened enough for her knife to slip beneath the cord. The next gust tightened the line. Naomi held the cloth away from the pane with her shoulder and cut through only the frozen loop. The knot came free. So did half the tension. The upper slat twisted sharply. Faye struck the glass from inside with her brush handle, the signal they had agreed upon if the cover sagged toward the pane. Naomi caught the slat before it turned flat against the burlap. She could not trust another fixed knot. Anything tied tightly enough to survive the wind might freeze too solid to release. In the shed, she shaved a short willow branch into a flat toggle, drilled its center, and threaded the cord around it. Turned sideways, it held tension. Turned back, it released, even through thick gloves. When she tested it, the burlap settled into place. Faye opened the door. That is better. It is different, Naomi said. The new pull had corrected the frozen corner, but the slat now bowed near the middle. Every improvement moved the strain somewhere else. Wagon bells sounded from the trail. Thomas Vale guided a freight team toward the rise, his coat powdered with road dust and old snow. He had known Naomi's husband from the Sweetwater runs, though he rarely visited without cause. When he saw the dark covers across the cabin windows, he slowed instead of laughing. He placed one gloved hand in the moving air beside the burlap, then reached behind its edge without disturbing the spacing. Dead air, he said. Quieter air, Naomi answered. Thomas nodded. Same reason we set canvas away from the bedrolls at Bitter Creek. Put it close, and the wind drives through. Leave room, and the first wall takes the beating. Faye appeared in the doorway with the frost card. Silas says the cloth will rot the frame. It might, Thomas said. If she leaves it wet, Naomi appreciated that he did not pretend the idea had no weakness. She showed him the frozen groove, the willow toggle, and the bowed slat. Where did freight canvas fail first? Corners? Then wherever a man tied it too proud? Too tight. Same thing in a storm. He pointed to the upper slat. The wind pulls here. That nail holds there. All the strain meets in one place until wood or cloth gives. Naomi took down the cover again. She cut diagonal strips from her last sound feed sack and sewed them across the inner corners, spreading the pull beyond the original seams. Thomas held the frame steady while Faye copied the stitch onto the frost card. Naomi made the second toggle broader and moved the cord away from the split grain. By dusk, the cover flexed without striking the pane. Faye checked the glass from inside. The center dots remained clear. She added another blue line, then folded the card into her apron pocket. The paper creased across the middle, and a drop of lamp oil left a dark crescent near the east window drawing. Thomas studied the repaired cover before returning to his team. "You built the better part of it," he told Naomi. "But do not mistake today's win for the one coming." He had seen relay ropes freeze stiff before noon. North of the crossing, a low gray band had settled over the plain, flat as iron and moving south. "How long?" Naomi asked. "Maybe 2 days," Thomas said. "Maybe less, and it will be stronger than anything those sacks have met." Thomas returned the next afternoon carrying a folded strip of freight canvas beneath one arm. The gray band in the north had thickened, though the wind still came in short, testing gusts. Naomi had already taken the north cover down. It lay across the table with chalk marks showing where the bowed slat pulled hardest. Thomas set the canvas beside it. "Cut from a wagon fly," he said, "too narrow for the freight company to mend." Naomi rubbed the dense weave between her fingers. "You brought it for the corners?" "I brought it because you know where it belongs." Faye looked up from the frost card. It was the first time a grown man had come asking Naomi how to build something instead of telling her what she had done wrong. Naomi placed the canvas along the cover's outer edge, then removed it. "Too much weight across the whole top. We use only enough to protect the side taking the pull." She cut 2 narrow bands and laid them diagonally across the weak corners. Faye threaded the thick needle while Thomas shaved a replacement spacer block to Naomi's measurement. Naomi showed Faye how to begin beyond the old seam. "Do not stitch only where it tore. Carry the strain into cloth that has not been weakened." Faye's first row wandered. Naomi did not pull it out. She placed a straighter line beside it until both rows shared the burden. When they rehung the cover, the canvas edge held firm, but its weight drew the lower slat downward. Thomas pressed 2 fingers beneath the center. "This piece will not last a full win." "It may not last the evening," Naomi said. She marked the bend with chalk and had Faye add it to the card. Reduced frost did not make weaky wood strong. They worked until lamplight replaced the afternoon. Thomas cut a broader, lower slat from dry pine. Naomi drilled cord holes farther from the grain's edge. Faye stitched the second corner without help. The finished cover looked worse than before. Burlap lettering crossed one panel. Blue thread showed at both corners. The canvas strip was darker than the sacks, and the new slat had not been planed smooth. It also stood evenly away from the glass. Inside, Faye held the frost card against the pane. The center marks are still clear. Naomi touched the narrow frost rim near the bottom, marked that darker. The air settles colder there. Thomas stayed for supper because the light was failing and his team was at the relay barn. Naomi served rabbit stew, biscuits, and the last spoonful of apple preserves. For a time, no one spoke of the coming weather. Faye spread the card beside her bowl and explained the blue lines. The first night had nearly buried the uncovered pane. The covered window had kept 4 central dots clear. The second test had shown more frost below after the snow-soaked burlap grew heavier. Thomas listened without interrupting. "You kept this from the first night." Faye glanced at Naomi. "She told me to." "You kept it," Naomi said. "I only asked for marks." Faye flattened the creased paper. "At first I thought the covers made the cabin look poor." The room went still. "I thought people would see the sacks before they saw anything else." She looked toward the north window. "Now I think they will see whether the glass is whole." Naomi lowered her spoon. Her late husband had described canvas walls at winter camps, but the sewing, spacing, toggles, and tests belonged to the hands at this table. "For once," Naomi said so plainly. He gave me the first idea. The rest we learned here. Thomas nodded toward Faye's card. Then the freight station should learn it here too. Faye smiled before she could hide it. A gust struck the cabin. The weighted cover bowed outward, then snapped back. The lower slat gave a dry pop along the old nail hole. Naomi reached the window as the wood split from end to center. The broken edge drove into the burlap, ripping the blue-stitched corner wide open. Naomi had the torn cover off the wall before the next gust arrived. The split slat lay across the kitchen table, one half still caught in the blue-stitched corner. Faye held the lamp close while Naomi traced the break with her finger. The wood had not failed at random. The old nail hole had concentrated every pull into one narrow place until the grain opened. By morning, Silas Webb's wagon stood at the gate. He came carrying a measuring rod and the expression of a man who believed the argument had ended in his favor. Two neighbors followed him far enough to watch from the fence. "I heard the cover tore," he said. "It did." Silas looked at the stained burlap, the split wood, and the loose cords. "Then take the rest down before the weather does it for you." Naomi lifted the broken slat. The slat failed. The whole contraption failed. No, it showed me where the force collected. Silas glanced toward the dark windows. "You can call a crack a lesson, but broken glass will still cost the same." He offered to strip the covers from all three windows and fit temporary boards if a pane shattered. The boards, the labor, and any spring glass would go into his winter book. Naomi refused. Silas's mouth hardened. "Then do not say no one warned you." After he left, Naomi removed every cover. That was when the real weakness appeared. Each fixed knot had pulled against one small section of wood. The north slat showed a fresh groove. The west frame had begun to splinter around a fastening. Even the east cover, which had faced the least wind, carried a pale strain line where the cord crossed the corner. Faye touched it. All of them. All of them. They could not repair one cover. They had to rebuild the fastening system before the gray weather reached the trail. Thomas arrived with dry pine from the relay shed. He cut wider slats while Naomi bored holes farther from the edges. Faye carved short wooden toggles from willow and rubbed them smooth enough to turn through gloved hands. Naomi replaced every rigid knot with a loop that could give under strain. Then she ran cross-lacing from the upper corners toward the center slats, spreading each pull across a broader section of wood. The work consumed the last of her good waxed cord. Faye dragged the thick needle through the final folded corner until her fingers cramped. Naomi took the needle, but Faye closed her hand around it. "I can finish." Her stitches were uneven. They were also tight. There are times when people decide what protection is worth by how handsome it looks from the road. They rarely ask what cold it has measured, what strain it has survived, or whose hands repaired it in the dark. Have you ever seen something useful dismissed simply because it was not beautiful? By late afternoon, all three covers hung again. They looked rougher than before. The north cover carried mismatched slats, dark water stains, and a blue patch wider than Naomi's hand. Yet when Thomas pulled against the corner, the force traveled through the cross-lacing instead of biting into one nail hole. Naomi turned a toggle with her mittened hand. It released. She tightened it again. The burlap flexed outward, then settled without touching the pane. Inside, Faye compared the blue dots with her frost card. The torn card had split farther along its crease, so she threaded the halves together with leftover sewing cotton. The covered pane still held clear centers. "It works," she said. "It works in this wind." The light outside changed before Thomas could answer. The northern sky lost its shape. Gray swallowed the low hills, and a hiss moved across the winter grass ahead of the storm itself. Thomas crossed to the door. That came faster than the relay report. Naomi checked the wood box, the shutters, the spare canvas strip, and the tools already laid beneath the north window. She placed one replacement slat, 2 toggles, a hammer, an awl, and the remaining cord inside a grain sack. The first ice struck the roof like thrown sand. Then the wind hit. The cabin groaned from sill to ridge. All 3 burlap covers snapped outward at once, held for one breath, and flexed back into place. Faye looked at Naomi, hope rising too soon. A second blast struck from the west. The upper fastening tore free with a sharp wooden crack. Half the west cover ripped away from the wall, and the loose slat began hammering against the window frame. Naomi pulled the grain sack over one shoulder and turned to Faye. Watch the blue dots. If the cloth touches the glass, strike the pane twice. If the frost jumps past the middle marks, strike once and keep striking. Faye's face had gone pale, but she nodded. Thomas opened the door only wide enough to look outside. Ice dust swept past the threshold in a solid sheet. The west cover snapped like a flag, one corner still tied, while the broken slat beat against the casing. "We can board it from inside," he shouted, "and lose the test in the light." Naomi answered, "The pane will still take the full wind. It may take your hand first." Naomi pulled on her mittens, then hold the ladder. She stepped into the ice wind. Cold seized the damp wool at her cuffs. The air carried no clean flakes, only fine frozen grains that scraped her cheeks and filled every seam in her coat. Thomas dragged the ladder beneath the west window and planted both boots against its feet. Naomi climbed with the grain sack tied close to her body. The loose slat swung toward her. She caught it against her forearm, but the frozen cord at the upper corner would not turn on the new toggle. Ice had packed around the loop until wood and line felt like one piece. Inside, Faye held the frost card against the pane. The first blue dots near the western edge disappeared beneath white. Naomi jammed the awl beneath the frozen loop. The point slipped. She tried again, twisting until the cord lifted enough to show the problem. The old strand had frozen around the nail beneath the toggle. Releasing the wood alone would not free it. She could leave the line and let the slat keep striking. Or she could cut it and surrender the entire upper half of the cover to the wind. Naomi drew her knife. Thomas looked up. "Once you cut that, I cannot hold the cloth from down here." "I know." She sawed through the cord. The cover exploded outward. For one breath, the whole pane stood bare. Then the burlap folded back toward the glass, driven flat by the wind. Faye struck twice from inside. Naomi threw the freight canvas strip across the loose upper edge and caught both ends around the ladder rail. The canvas took the first pull. Thomas seized the lower end and leaned his weight into it. "Hold there," Naomi called. "Not tighter." He obeyed. The burlap hovered a hand's width from the pane. Naomi tore away the split slat, fitted the replacement through the corner sleeve, and threaded a fresh loop through the new hole. Her mitten caught on the awl. The tool slipped from the rung and vanished into the blowing snow. She had no second one. Faye opened the door a crack and pushed the hammer handle through. "Use the nail." Naomi took a spare nail from the sack, drove it through the frozen burlap fold, and widened the opening by turning it with the hammer. The cord passed through. Her right mitten split across the palm. Cold bit through at once. Naomi wrapped the loose leather around the cord, hauled the slat level, and set the wooden toggle crosswise. Then she rerouted the canvas strip through the cross-lacing so the pressure moved away from the glass and into two sound sections of frame. "Ease it," she told Thomas. He released the strap by inches. The cover bowed outward, shuddered, and settled. It did not strike the pane. Inside, Faye pressed her face near the window. The frost had buried the edge dots, but the middle row remained blue and clear. She struck the glass once, then raised her hand in triumph. Naomi climbed down with one bare, reddened palm curled against her coat. The lower burlap edge had shredded into dark threads, and the lost awl was already buried. Yet the new toggle turned when she tested it. The cover moved with the wind instead of fighting every gust. Thomas pulled the door open. Faye had placed the patch frost card on the table. "The center never closed," she said, "not even when the cover went loose." Naomi looked from the card to her sister. Faye touched the blue-stitched corner visible through the glass. "You were right to leave it ugly." Naomi did not answer with a lesson. She wrapped Faye's aching fingers between her own damaged gloves, then reached for the spare cord. A sharp crack sounded from the east window. Faye spun toward it, clutching the frost card in both hands. Naomi crossed the room before the second crack could come. The east pane was still whole. A thin wooden stop along the inner edge had split where an old nail entered the frame. Each gust made the loosened strip jump against the glass, sharp enough to sound like a fracture. Faye held the frost card close to the pane. White had covered the outer row of blue dots, but the center remained clear. "The glass did not break," she said. "Not yet." Naomi pressed both hands against the wooden stop. The frame steadied, but the pressure returned the moment she eased away. Outside, the east cover pulled unevenly against its upper chords. Thomas reached for the door. "Tell me what to move." Naomi looked through the pane, measuring the cover by the way its lower edge rose and fell. "Do not take it down. Loosen the upper right toggle 1/4 turn, then pass the canvas strip through the center lacing." Thomas nodded once and stepped into the wind. Naomi wedged the hammer handle beneath the broken stop and used a folded scrap of leather to keep the iron from pressing directly against the glass. Faye stood beside her with the patched frost card, calling each change she saw. "The edge is whitening faster." Naomi shouted through the wall, "Too loose. Take back half of what you gave it." The cover tightened. The split stop trembled but no longer jumped. Thomas threaded the remaining canvas through the cross lacing and carried its pull toward two sound portions of the frame. Naomi shifted the hammer handle lower. The glass stopped rattling long enough for her to drive a small bracing nail into unbroken wood. A gust struck from the northeast. The west cover bowed. The north cover twisted. The east cover pulled hard enough to make the cabin boards groan. All three held. For the next hour, the storm changed direction twice. Naomi moved from window to window, feeling the frames, turning inner braces, and calling adjustments to Thomas whenever the covers began drawing too hard on one corner. Faye followed with the card, tracing frost lines over the old blue marks. The card grew damp at the edges, its cotton repair stretched. One brittle corner broke away in Faye's hand. She placed the loose piece on the table and kept working. By the time the wind reached its worst, frost had swallowed the outer dots on every pane. It stopped before the center line on two windows. On the damaged east frame, it crept slightly beyond one middle mark, then held. The glass remained whole. The stove fire burned lower than Naomi wanted, but the room never fell into the killing cold that came through an open pane. They used less than half the emergency wood stacked beside the hearth. Near dawn, the sound outside began to change. The shrieks softened into long breaths. The covers still moved, but they no longer snapped against their slats. Thomas came inside with ice crusted across his coat. He shut the door and leaned against it while Naomi checked the final frame. "No broken glass," Faye said. Thomas looked at the blue marks still visible through the panes. "No boards over the windows either." Naomi unwrapped her injured hand. The skin was raw where the mitten had split. The awl was gone, the waxed cord nearly spent, and the north cover hung in ragged strips along its lower edge. One east frame would need rebuilding in spring, but the three panes had survived. Faye held the torn frost card against the north glass. The surviving blue center dots matched the clear space exactly. Thomas studied them without speaking, then removed his hat to wipe the ice from his brow. After sunrise, people began appearing along the trail. One cabin west of the crossing had lost a kitchen pane. Another had packed blankets into a cracked frame. A family near the relay barn had burned almost all its remaining wood before morning. Silas Webb came up the rise carrying a wrapped sheet of replacement glass for the first household. He stopped beneath Naomi's windows. The burlap covers were stained, frayed, patched with blue thread, and crooked against the pale morning sky. Behind them, every pane remained clear enough to reflect him. Silas lowered the wrapped glass and stared at the repaired corners. He set the wrapped pane against the fence and walked to the north window. He touched the frayed burlap, then examined the spacer blocks and the blue stitching around the torn corner. Ice still clung to the lower slat. Behind it, the glass was unbroken. "How much space did you leave?" he asked. "Enough for the cloth to take the wind without lying against the pane." "And these corners?" Naomi turned the wooden toggle with her bandaged hand. The first knots froze. The narrow slats split. These spread the pull. Silas looked toward the neighboring cabin where blankets filled an empty frame. His voice lost the easy humor it had carried before the storm. "Would you make a pattern for my storefront?" Naomi glanced at Faye. Her sister stood in the doorway, holding the torn frost card. One brittle corner was missing, and cotton thread held the center crease together. "For payment," Naomi said, "sound cloth, waxed cord, and enough dry wood to replace every damaged slat." Silas nodded. "And Faye shows you the frost marks." He looked at the blue dots on the pane. "Faye shows me." By the time the snow softened in March, Feed sacks appeared at the heart gate instead of mocking smiles. Naomi measured windows, marked spacer lengths, and taught families to leave room for still air. Faye showed them how to paint small dots along the glass and record where frost stopped. She no longer lowered her eyes when someone looked toward the cabin. At the freight station, Thomas fitted broad slats and wooden toggles across 2 exposed windows. When a driver asked who had designed them, he pointed up the trail toward Naomi's rise. Silas repaired the east frame with dry pine and paid for the pattern as promised. His storefront covers were neater than Naomi's, made from uniform canvas without faded flower lettering. But he copied the blue stitch corner exactly because that was the part that had survived after the first design failed. Naomi kept the original north cover. She washed away the salt but did not replace the mismatched slats or hide the broad blue patch. The torn lower edge was trimmed only enough to keep it from unraveling. Beside her sewing box, Faye stored the frost card between 2 flat pieces of wood so its damaged fold would not split farther. One warm morning, Naomi opened the north cover and folded it against the wall. Sunlight crossed the kitchen table. For the first time since autumn, the window stood uncovered without frost clouding its edges. Faye wiped the glass, leaving one blue mark near the center. "You missed a dot," Naomi said. "I left it." Outside, fresh canvas waited to be cut for another family. Faye picked up the measuring cord and stepped through the door before Naomi had to ask. The repaired burlap rested beside the window, weathered enough to tell the truth about what it had carried. In the clear pane, Faye's last blue dot shone beside the reflection of a cabin no one called abandoned anymore.